Okay, hello. So, hello everyone. We're here together today to discuss the Edinburgh Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Writers. We have with us the three editors in question, Alan Riach, Ronnie Black, and Caroline McCracken-Flesher. And we're just going to have a little bit of an informal conversation together about the kind of collaboration which has been going on with this project, reflect on the process up to now, where we're at, and the future of it from here. I'm Fiona. Me and Solana, we will be taking the interview today and seeing where we go with it. I'm in my second year of a PhD at Glasgow University in Scottish Literature, and have been doing a little bit of contributing work in the past few months to the project. Solana, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, and I work together with Caroline and Fiona and a couple other students. I'm from the University of Wyoming, getting my master's in English, and really excited to be a part of this project. So now we're going to take a second to introduce each of the co-editors, and Fiona will start by introducing Alan.
Yeah, so get an idea of who everybody is. Alan Riach is a poet and professor of Scottish literature at Glasgow University. Born in Airdrie, studied at the universities of Cambridge and Glasgow. He worked at the University of Waikato in New Zealand from 1986 to 2000, before returning to Scotland in 2001. He's since written several poetry books, works of criticism, and English language versions of Gaelic poems by Duncan Van McIntyre and Alistair McVister Alistair. He is co-author with Alexander Moffat of a series of publications on arts of resistance and arts of independence. He's also the co-editor of works including the Edinburgh Companion to 20th Century Scottish Literature and the general editor of the complete works of Hugh McDermott.
Great. And we also have with us today Caroline McCracken-Flesher, and she is a professor at the University of Wyoming, specializing in Scottish literature and British 19th century literature. She was educated at Edinburgh, Oxford, and Brown universities, and her works include 2 monographs from Oxford, as well as edited volumes on the Scottish Parliament, Scottish science fiction, and teaching Scottish writers. She holds a number of awards for her teaching, scholarly, and community work, including the Order of the Stag from Clan Scott Society.
Okay, and Ronnie Black, our third editor, who's educated in Celtic Studies at the University of Glasgow and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Dublin. He has worked as a cataloguer of Gaelic manuscripts in the National Library of Scotland, a lecturer in Celtic Studies at the Universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and he was a Gaelic editor of the Scotsman newspaper for nearly 40 years. He has edited anthologies of Gaelic verse and most recently a book on the Campbells of the Ark. Ronnie is currently the director of the Dewar Project and an honorary fellow in the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures at the University of Edinburgh. So now we have an idea of who everybody is. Solana, I think you have a few questions to start off our conversation.
Yeah, I think it's good for us to understand just a little bit more about the nature of this collaboration. So I want to hear from each of you, but maybe I will direct this question at Alan first. Is how did each of you come to be here working together on this project together?
Well, the original impetus for the project came from Ian Brown, and we should acknowledge him at the start. He and a number of people had been working on the Edinburgh University 3-volume history of Scottish literature. And one of the things that emerged from that was the idea of a series of companions for individual authors, and then from that, a series of biographical entries seemed a requirement, a timely requirement, a necessity, given that the work published by Macmillan by Trevor Royal on the companion to Scottish writers would be superseded by the sheer extent of the number of writers and the ways of approaching Scottish literature in its different languages and different ways of approaching it historically that had come about since then. So Ian initiated the idea. The idea was taken forward in various ways. Caroline and I were both involved in that, and others, many others, in fact. But the idea receded, and Ian decided that he did not any longer want to be the editor-in-chief of this project, but we all had a notion that this was a too good an idea to let drop entirely. And Caroline was approached, and Caroline and I, and we were both keen. Caroline, I think I was at the time I was keen that Caroline should be the primary editor of this, but we agreed that it was probably better actually to be collaborative in our project, and that the skills and range of understandings and references and contacts that we could bring to this could be better done jointly. And from that, after a period of time where we were looking at expanding the number of entries, it became very clear to us that we could not do this without a Gaelic editor. And Ronnie was invited to join us on essentially on those grounds. I mean, one of the important facts is that you have to know the limitations that you're dealing with. We would have been wrong for us to try and carry on without a Gaelic editor, I think. But then we had to also talk about and probe the question of the balance, the relationship between the Gaelic and the Scots and the English language entries, and we'll come on to talk about that. But you can see that as soon as we begin to take the project forward, and as soon as we answer certain questions about how to do that, more questions start to generate themselves.
Yeah.
And that Ian Brown was always keen that this would be a book with international resonance, right? That we know how very important it could be in Scotland, but he wanted an American editor alongside his Scottish team, and did do a lot of legwork to establish his initial team. And then when he asked us to take it over, he had done a lot of groundwork. And then our job was to really, I think at that point we'd realized how expansive it could become, as Alan said. And still today, finding the margins of it are problematic. But one of the essential pieces is to at least try to address literatures in Latin, right, in Gaelic. And increasingly, by the way, in Scotland, in languages that you might not expect, right, the languages of immigration into Scotland. Those are all questions for us, but Ronnie has been our essential partner these last many years, part of the discussion from the beginning, but really crucial as an editor in recent years.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk a little bit more about expanding the canon, but first I want to ask Ronnie, let's talk about the importance that 1/3 of these entries are dedicated to Gaelic writers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was very much in my mind when I was first approached by Ian Brown way back. And then I was disappointed that nothing seemed to come of that. But when Alan asked me about 10 years later in 2018, I think, if I would be willing to come on board the project, as we say in Gaelic, it wasn't running but jumping towards it, because, well, for lots of reasons. A biographical dictionary of Gaelic writers is an absolute desideratum for Celtic studies in Scotland, for Gaelic studies. We've got a work called The Companion to Gaelic Scotland, edited by Derek Thompson, way back in the 1970s, and there was a second edition of that, but it very badly needs updated, and we need to concentrate on writers and poets. I always call them writers and poets because in the Gaelic tradition, many poets couldn't write, so I always say writers and poets. And yes, the idea of this is one of the things that may prove controversial about our work. This third of it being devoted to Gaelic, another third to English, another third to Scots, of course, because when the first work on Scottish literature that I'm personally aware of was J.H. Miller's of 1903, which, as far as I can recall, did not acknowledge the existence of the Gaelic language at all. Then you had a number of works with a degree of tokenism. Of course, Hugh MacDiarmid deserves an honorary mention here for his golden treasury of Scottish verse, which certainly has some Gaelic items in it. But by the situation by the 1970s, was that Maurice Lindsay could produce his History of Scottish Literature, where he actually begins his introduction. The purpose of this book is to present to the general reader a full account of Scottish literature, full stop. And then he says, it is, of course, necessary to qualify this statement, since Gaelic literature does not come within the compass of the survey. So we're at a stage now where finally, after nearly 120 years, we've come full circle. We've worked out what the proportion of the Gaelic contribution to Scottish literature is. I think 1/3 is very, very fair for a number of reasons, and it's being taken up. For example, the new by Oxford Anthology of Scottish Poetry, 1730 to 1830, is going to be rough. I think something like 1/3, or at least a quarter, devoted to Gaelic poets. So we've arrived somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. And this project has been in the works for a few years now. So I was hoping maybe I could transition this back to Alan, because a huge piece of like this is that it's an international collaboration. So can we talk a little bit about maybe the background in New Zealand, the impetus on the Gaelic editions, and how that has integrated into this collaboration?
Yes, it's a major part of what we're thinking of. Ronnie pointed out that in those early histories of ostensibly purporting to be Scottish literature, it was a very select understanding of what that word meant. But not only is Scotland now understood to be plural, both in language and terrain, and complex and layered and multidimensional, if you like, in terms of history, it's also considered in the international context. So the ability to approach it with that in mind is imperative and continuous. I had that experience when I went. I went to Cambridge and then Glasgow as an undergraduate and a postgraduate, and then I worked for nearly 14 years in New Zealand, and had the good fortune to be able to teach and do some research in various institutions around the world. And where my centre of research had been the poet Hugh McDiarmid, other aspects of Scottish literature led on from there, and I was always curious about the whole phenomenon and that balance between what defines it, if definition is the word, and what connects it. How is it related in various ways at different speeds and against different national cultures, but also against different linguistic histories and different histories of political power and oppression and blossoming, in fact, in some cases. So when I was working in New Zealand, there was always that sense of, I'm introducing this subject to students who have no prior knowledge whatsoever, and neither you shouldn't expect them to. Why should they? Not only white Pākehā New Zealanders, but Maori students as well. And to make the point, Maori students did literally come up to me after I'd screened the Sheevy at the Stag and the Black Oil, and said, that's our story too. So to put the kind of cultural comparisons into the mix, there's always that imperative that what we do in Scottish literature and in Scotland is of immediate relevance to that universal context, but it has complete specificity in terms of the terrain and the logistics of the history and the people involved, all of these things. That balance is really important. So as Caroline said, from the beginning, the idea that as an American academic, Caroline was essential to the project to have that multiple perspective brought into the editorial team, international perspective, but also for us all to be aware of, and again, to make that point, Ronnie has pointed out very emphatically that a major component of Gaelic writing comes from Canada in the wake of the clearances and that whole history. So it can never be entirely defined as a single thing. It's always crumbling and reforming itself. But the imperative, if we're ever going to get to the end of this, we have to say that's what it is. And all of those questions opening up have to be present in the introduction and borne in mind with particular authors as we go through.
Yeah, and let's jump in there, because to me, as a student working on this, the internationality of this project kind of reflects how wide-reaching some of maybe the definition of what it means to be a Scottish writer is. So I want to hand it over to Fiona, and we can talk about how you decided who to include.
To Fiona or to Caroline?
I think to Fiona, to
Okay.
talking about the selection process a little bit.
I think Fiona may be frozen, so we can continue with the conversation while we're waiting.
Yeah, great. So
Oh no, here we go.
I'll expand.
I think we're losing her for the moment, but we got the question, Solana, the issue of how to determine who we were going to include. And actually it's a big challenge, and we decided to meet the challenge by kind of ignoring it and including anybody and everybody that could potentially be relevant. And many, that's sort of a joke, but it's also true, because as Alan said, what's considered important, and as Ronnie pointed out very much with those early equivalent volumes, it's a very, very selective process, right, typically, and it's marked by its moment. And we have the great advantage of living in the world of Google and so on, where our travels take us much more broadly, even in our search for who you might consider a Scottish writer. And by the way, I'd say for our students in America, right, we get into discussions about John Muir, or about authors, the Scottish communities in Appalachia and the American South and so on. What are the stages of inclusion? How far out, how many generations might you consider someone to be part of a Scottish tradition, or how do they consider themselves part of a Scottish tradition? So our response has been to be inclusive, which means that we draw on field experts, we draw on the kind of explorations that you yourselves are doing as part of the project, and generate as many possibilities as we can, and we're getting as much information as we can. Will everybody be included in the book? That's a slightly different question, right? And that question is going to be determined a little bit by principles of selection. To just give you a sense of how those have shifted for us, though, I mean, originally we were thinking people with multiple books, people with awards, etc. That criterion very quickly disappeared because those criteria themselves have their contextual limitations, right? So what we'll be doing as we now move to the editing stage, where we have a massive number of entries assembled, is another level of selection that's going to, for one thing, sometimes pick people as representative of a tradition if we can't include a whole tradition, and also have the option of an electronic, an online medium by which where we can locate pieces that we're not able to include now, but that might be elaborated subsequently. And we think of this volume, massive as it's going to be, as very much part of a much broader cultural project and bigger cultural project that's going to continue beyond what we're able to publish in the next couple of years.
I might just add to that an example to illustrate what we're talking about. That the one discussion that we had was to do with the fact that Hugh McDermott, in his exercise of what you might call provocative wisdom or wise provocation, suggested that the greatest Scottish novel of all time was Moby Dick. And this faced us with the challenge of, should we include Herman Melville in the biography of Scottish writers? And we decided probably not. And one of the reasons for that was partly because it was to do with the fact that Melville has a very well-established place in the canon of American literature, and the history of his biography and his connections to Scotland is not unfamiliar if you go in that direction. To claim him as a Scottish writer, and you might actually extend that and think about the cultural legacies in New England, and Hawthorne might be another person that you would cite in that example. But more than that, with Melville, there's a peculiar biographical fact that he did come to Scotland, and Caroline, in fact, went to Abbotsford, and I think if I'm right in saying found Melville's autograph in the visitors book, as it were, at Walter Scott's house in Abbotsford. So in terms of Melville's own psychological yearning for an understanding of his own genetic history and how that informs the kind of mind that produced Moby Dick, there's some truth in what McDiarmid was provocatively gesturing towards. But that doesn't legitimise our inclusion of him as a Scottish novelist, because however you define those terms, Scottish writer, it's not necessarily applicable in such a way. But all of these questions may come up in the introduction that we're going to write. So that aspect of keeping these concerns and sensitivities alive is very important, I think.
We should say here that I think we're also, we're also keen to include, Ronnie was saying, there's the issue of writers and people who did not write down their creative work. But we're now challenged by writers of comics, for instance, right? Writers of song, both older and quite recent. You probably are alert to the fact how Scots dominate, at least in Britain, the pop charts, but we lose sight of their Scottishness. So what in terms of genre are the limits of our inclusion? And again, we're going to find ourselves, first of all, as an ever-opening edge. Yeah, so we'll be talking about a lot of these in terms of their validity, but how we need to make representative choices within this edition of the book.
Yeah, you can go for breadth, can't you? And you can include Herman Melville, for example, and we are in fact including Lord Byron, because we're not unaware that of the existence of precise definitions, are we? There is a precise definition of what a Scottish writer is. A Scottish writer is a writer who was born in Scotland or who has lived in Scotland. But then as has been said, really, it's a dynamic process, and it's also a democratic and slightly haphazard process, in that people suggest entries to us. I've had lots of entries suggested to me, and I was really surprised at the sheer volume of the number of Canadian writers and poets who were suggested to it. I can see the reason for that. They're marginal in their own country, but they're not quite as marginal to us. So I can see the argument for breadth, but I think the most important thing we can do in this, personally, I think, is about depth. We could bore down further into, yes, all the traditions of Scottish writing, and find the people and give prominence, some prominence to the little writers, the lesser heard of writers, and we can tell the English language reading public about the Gaelic writers, and we can talk about the Latin writers who are perhaps not very fashionable anymore for obvious reasons. We can go down there and find the ordinary people whose voices lie there waiting still to be heard.
Yeah, it's great to get an idea of the sheer kind of immensity of this project then, and how it's going to keep developing, and all the priorities and factors informing who's been selected, or who's been kicked out. But we're it was important as well, kind of thinking writers more underrepresented as well. Has that been a kind of priority throughout?
So we lost part of your question, Fiona, but we think it was about underrepresented writers in general.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry about the technical issues.
And I think we're doing fabulously well, given how international this is already. Yeah. And the answer is, I think we have actually worked quite hard, partly by the mechanisms that Ronnie's talking about, where people volunteered things to us, right? So always our colleagues have knowledge and connections that we don't have, and that's the big virtue of something like this. And so we're learning all the time about lesser known writers. We're also in a position to bring back to the fore writers who were very important in their time and got forgotten, or who circulated in popular genres that weren't collected or valued at the time. And so you'll find, for instance, some people who wrote for newspapers surging back to the foreground because they were so important in the 19th century. Scottish newspapers and syndication were a big deal coming out of places like Dundee. And some of those writers who were serialized, people like David Pay, for instance, their syndication went all around the country and competed favorably with Dickens, I should point out, by the way. They were some of the most read people. And so, you know, all of those people are going to, and many of those, by the way, are women writers. And so we are, I think this is going to be a treasure trove actually for scholars. And I know, Fiona, you yourself have already been focusing on writers who might connect with your own research, right? And you're discovering people in it and finding things out about people where you're going to be the expert going forward. You're definitely the expert. And so ideally, this is going to be, I think, a book for a pretty wide audience, but scholars are going to find it really, really useful in tracking people who might otherwise sort of not rise to prominence in their primary research, but really need to be included for any full understanding of the questions that they're pursuing.
Yeah,
we might add, sorry, Fiona, on you go.
Oh no, this will maybe come up in my question anyway. I was just going to say this really has implications then in the publication of this book for readdressing Scottish canonicity, doesn't it? And yeah, I wondered if you had anything to say about that. I think Solana has a few more questions about with regards to that as well.
Alan, do you want to address that question first?
Oh, sure. Yes, it does. The notion of canon, the notion of a canon, is usually signifies a very short list of a small number of names, and this is not what we're doing. That expansion of first of all, I guess, let me put it this way. First of all, the entries themselves are quite brief and they're factual. So no writer is going to get an extended critical interpretation, but it simply indicates that these writers are there and that their significance in what they wrote and when and where they were writing is noted. So that immediately expands the process itself, or the product that we're envisaging itself, is a kind of interrogation of canonicity. That's not to say that we're not also saying there are great writers who wrote work of great magnitude, extent and depth, and these people are there, and for various reasons that involves other complex issues to do with why in certain periods of history are they predominantly men? Why in certain periods of history are there particular emphases and privileges given to certain groups for certain reasons? How has Gaelic been disadvantaged in very particular ways at very precise moments in history? All of these questions are there, and they also contribute to an understanding of and a subversion of canonicity. In other words, the canon itself is not a stable thing. It has to purport to be a canon in some sense, but the canon itself is always up for discussion, and we're taking that, I think, as our premise. So we want to bring such writers as have been neglected back, not only for the sake of reclaiming neglected writers, which is a good enough reason in itself, but also for the sake of saying we need to look at the whole scene and the whole history of that with this sensitivity, with this in mind.
Yeah, to some extent, it's a statistical exercise. I mean,
yeah.
we can throw statistics around. For example, my understanding is that we'll probably end up with about 1,500 writers in this book, give or take the odd 100. That's the way it's looking.
And it's more like the give or take, give the odd 100, because it's
Yeah.
more like approaching 1700 right now.
And there are statistical questions within, tucked inside the equations. For example, talking about women and talking about the Gaelic contribution to Scottish literature. Gaelic has always been rather famous for having a relatively high proportion of women poets. Well, let's see whether that really proves to be the case at the end of it. I think the proportion of women amongst the Gaelic writers is indeed high, but then we're going to efforts when faced with a choice, we're picking women in preference to men. So we are manipulating. We could be accused of manipulating the canon slightly, but then we could it can be argued that we're readjusting to what is correct. We are exposing the women to view who were previously hidden away somewhere. And then the odd things come up. For example, I noticed that despite all these Canadian poets who were suggested to us, only one of them was a woman. What happened to women in Gaelic literature when people were cleared off to Nova Scotia? What happened to them? And the one woman amongst those was born in Scotland. So and it's admitted, I queried this, and I asked the contributor of the entry on that one Canadian woman to discuss the issue, and he said, yes, it does seem to be a fact. They kept their heads down once they were over there, but he doesn't quite understand why. I don't, but maybe this is just one of dozens or even hundreds of little questions that our work will throw up at the end of the day.
And I think Ronnie puts it really well right there. It's one of the questions that's going to be thrown out, because while on the one hand, we're very, very keen, right, to fully represent neglected Gaelic writers, right, who are significant, important writers. And we're including all writers of significance, anybody we can find information on and so on, for it's data hungry, this book. At the same time, I think our most interesting work is going to be at the point where we have to make the choices about what goes to the electronic edition right now, what stays in the book. And I think at that point, we'll be thinking a little bit about our statistics. And you know, the ultimate call is going to be when you have people of equal importance, right, but an underrepresented possibility, right? That's when you can make a difference. But I think that there's going to be some really interesting statistical work that, as Ronnie points out, comes out of this book. So that where we've done our best to be inclusive between the book and any online platform that we are able to have. And we hope, by the way, that people will carry this forward, right, and expand more. But we also know that it should be, we hope, searchable, right? That you'll be able to yourself as a scholar pursue women who wrote for newspapers or Canadian writers in Gaelic and see a huge hole that needs to be understood more fully. And perhaps it's not really a hole, perhaps it's just that there weren't any publication venues, or they're in less known libraries or some archives or something like that. So I think it's going to be provocative statistically. We're doing our best, but I think it's got real uses that will help people evolve the great reach of our understanding of the corpora, right? What's available in Scottish writing and song.
Yeah.
And just to pick up on that, could I just say that there are traditionally there are a couple of gaps, certainly, that have existed since the Companion to Gaelic Scotland came out. At one extreme, we've got the spiritual poets who have never had much of a place in the canon before, religious verse, some of it very, very good. And at the other extreme, we've got body verse, which for obvious reasons, editors were traditionally very, very careful of. So a good deal of work has been done on both those categories that I'm aware of in the past, shall we say, 30, 40 years. It's time to bring those categories into the center of the canon.
Yeah. We can't deny that this is in that way kind of a political word too, because it's including the reaches of people that have been neglected for a long time. And we're excited to be a part of that project. But for the sake of time, maybe we can move on to talk a little bit about the value of the collaboration altogether. And I think Fiona has some questions about that too.
Yeah, so as we can see, it's going to be a very important book. But what is the value of this kind of collaborative method of research more generally, I guess, would be my question. And yeah, like how it's been compiled over the time, international, inter-institute, overall value of this.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because here we are as the three primary collaborators, but we've had lots and lots of additional collaborators. And they are international themselves, right? So we have contributors from Taiwan and, you know, from Canada, from you name it, we've probably got a contributor from there. I think part of the issue is exactly what a book like this demonstrates, is that our field is vast and changing, and none of us knows everything, and all of us depend on the network of knowledge. And there's been tremendous generosity in our colleagues in sharing their time and their knowledge and working with us to build this book, right? It's a building process and a collaborative process at its heart, I think.
I think that's right. And I think also the point to emphasize is to do with the fact that the contributors are also kind of co-editors in the same way. And that one of the priorities of our role as the kind of senior editors, as it were, was to make sure that the remit for the contributors would include senior scholars who were completely in charge of all of the material that could be we could have access to in whatever field of study they were excelling in, but also what we might call junior scholars or students who are still working towards an MPhil or towards a PhD, but who are competent and capable in terms of what scholarly research is, to make and this is one of the virtues of every entry being very slimmed down and factual, fact-based, that it doesn't call for extensive writing, but it does call for that degree of editorial understanding. In other words, by doing that, the students and the junior scholars, so to speak, who are contributing are in the company of the senior scholars and everybody who's contributing to it. In other words, essentially, it's the kind of democratic rule of all the contributions, which will be overlooked before the final work is sent forward, finally. The extent of the variety of inclusiveness extends to the editorial and the process and the contributors themselves. So we're very grateful to Fiona and to Solana for being among the contributors. Absolutely. And that are part of the company, put it that way.
Yeah, we can probably speak of the value of the project from being involved as well. And I know that it's been really interesting to me at this very, very early stage in my career, help lesser with my skills and these networks that we're creating right now. I'm sure Solana could second that as well.
Yeah, and I think in light of this conversation, it's really interesting for me too to learn firsthand, maybe for the first time, what it means to be a Scottish writer. And when I get entries that I'm working on, I treat them all with the same weight, because I don't know I don't have this background in what it means to be a Scottish writer in the same way that some of my collaborators across the pond might. So it's been really interesting for me to be a part of this conversation of how do we understand what it means to be included in this book. So I've really enjoyed working on it and working internationally with my counterparts too.
Awesome. Yeah, we've had a very rich conversation. I feel like we could go on for hours and hours, honestly. Not that my Wi-Fi by the looks of it. But kind of have
Well, you cut out a little bit there, Fiona, but maybe we can just wrap up with a couple last questions here. We want to know, when will this book be published? And yeah, let's start with there. When will this book be published?
Well, we should say we think we are in the closing stages, thanks to our students, actually, who have really advanced the process. And I know, Ronnie, you have people working with you as well, collecting, as you said before, you know, still very actively collecting in Scotland. And
well, a little bit inhibited by COVID, I should say, because I have one person in particular who was going from door to door in the island of Lewis, asking about the lives of poets whose work was well remembered, but whose lives weren't so well known about. And COVID put a stop to that, I'm afraid. I hope she'll do a wee bit in the coming summer.
Yeah, and we know we're a little bit limited by even the medium of Zoom as we are today, but that's just where we are. But I think things have really speeded up with the help of the graduate students in Glasgow and the graduate students here in Laramie, and it has been tremendously helpful. And so we are hopeful that we should come to the end of our work in the next year. And so we're hopeful that it'll be advancing to the press at that point. And of course, between now and then, there are some really tough decisions, because we're going to have to decide those few that can't be included in the print copy for obvious reasons, just of length. There's some deathless prose that will probably fall by the wayside, but we're very confident that this will be a book that people find valuable, and that will do proper work for Scottish literary culture.
I think that's right. And I think one of the great virtues, what we're hoping for, is that the book will have the book in itself, the kind of book that it is. Obviously it's a reference book, but at the same time, the sense of it being having the function in a way of what a library is, that you go in, you might be looking for something and you find something that you hadn't expected was there at all, and that there are connections between things that you hadn't even been able to imagine before you started browsing around and looking at looking in this way. So the intention of the book is to make that more possible, and if we do that, that's what we're hoping for.
Absolutely, and the word collaboration has been used. I'd like to throw in another word: integration. This book, arguably for the very first time, will integrate all the bits and pieces of what Scottish writing is: the Gaelic, the Latin, the Scots, the English, the Old Welsh, and the other languages which I'm not so sure about, but which Caroline has mentioned. Bringing it all together, renewing, reinvigorating, renewing the canon, integrating all the bits and pieces.
And indeed, working at the borders of that, as Ronnie mentioned earlier, writers and poets, but the emphasis being upon the whole history of the written culture, but also the whole history of the oral culture, and the understanding, therefore, that these things are not separate. They overlap, they integrate, they nourish each other in very special ways. And that, I think, also has been neglected in terms of our understanding of what literature is in that broader sense.
Yeah. And I think we're realizing that the work that this book is doing, the work that you all are doing, that Ronnie's student is doing, going door to door, requires another conversation. But I just want to thank Caroline, Ronnie, and Alan for talking with us, and my counterpart Fiona for leading this discussion. And it was really awesome to hear more about your book.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.